Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a show about the mysterious twists and turns that the road of life takes us as we go down. And today I think we have a particularly mysterious twist and turn. I'm Dan Hall, one of your hosts. I'm here in lovely Olympia, Washington. My friend and co-host, Gwen Farrell, is in lovely Phoenix, Arizona. So how are you
Mhm.
doing today, Gwen?
Doing great. Just putting up the Christmas decorations. How about
Oh
you?
yeah, that's true. I've got mine up. I had mine up since Thanksgiving, so
Oh,
I'm, one of those kind of people. Well, today we have Mark Olly on with us. Mark is coming from the UK, and he's written an interesting book that kind of talks about the equivalent of a UFO event in the UK that is very similar to what happened to Roswell. And there's the
there
Europe's
it is.
Roswell, just on cue.
There you go. I always come prepared.
Yeah, that's
There
good.
you go.
So, welcome, Mark. Going to welcome you to our show today. And Gwen has a little bio that she's going to read, and then we're going to have at it.
Okay, thank you. Our guest today, Mark Olly, has had careers as a writer, an archaeologist, a historian, and a television presenter. He was educated at Warrington College of Art and Design, the University of Liverpool Institute in Field Archaeology. He also studied business and biblical studies.
Hmm.
For over 22 years, he worked as a professional musician and in music management. He has appeared on Carlton Television's The History Detectives, wrote and presented ITV Granada's award-nominated Lost Treasures series, has presented for Sky History Channel, and been featured on Ancient Aliens. He also writes, presents, and directs DVDs for Reality Entertainment's reality films and has written and directed music videos. Mark has 9 major books in print, and including his newest, which he just showed to us, Europe's Roswell, 40 years since impact, that he's going to be sharing with us today. I read it and it is a goodie. So let's get to it. Mark Olly, welcome to Anomalies.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an absolute
Mhm.
pleasure.
Sure. Well, I'll just guess I'll kick us off here. So, this is a little bit of an unusual story in the sense that it seems to me, as I recall the narrative, you found out about this case by reading the newspaper rather than by going out and investigating. Is that, do I have that right?
Well, it wasn't me actually. It was a guy called Gary Rowe who
Right.
ran a group of ufologists in North Wales, and he subscribed to a newspaper clipping agency, which in the old days, back in the 1980s and 90s, they send you newspaper clippings they think would be of interest to you. Obviously, we don't do that now. We have the internet instead, so you can find things out that way. But he got this newspaper article, and it basically said debris, strange debris from out of the sky. And it gave lots of details that Gary was familiar with because it's Wales, it's where Gary lives. And this thing had apparently crashed during the night or had hit trees, as it turns out, scattering debris over 4 fields. But the substance of this craft, the engines and the structure and the drivers and all that, was still able to fly off. So that's really how I got involved because Gary contacted me as an archaeologist and he said, do you want to come and dig up a UFO? So we we kind of looked into it a bit deeper, and it turns out I'd got visions of this thing hitting the ground like a Spitfire, crashing and going
Uh-huh.
into the ground, burying itself, and then we could have gone along and dug it up. That's not what happened. As I just said, it hit trees and then flew off. So having looked at the details of the crash, the evidence around it, I sort of said to Gary, well, I'm pretty useless. I'm not going to be able to dig anything up. I'm not sure how I can help in this case. And then he said those immortal words. He said, well, I've got some pieces of the crash debris in a case in my garage. And I'm like, oh, really?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Now that's a bit more interesting because that's the kind of thing archaeologists like. We like to get hold of things, actually, objects, physical evidence. And I was like, oh, well, I might be interested in seeing that. Do you want me to carry on? Do you want me to plow into the story a little bit further?
Sure, sure.
Sure,
Take
Okay.
us wherever you want to take us.
Okay. Well, the guy that actually witnessed the debris field was a farmer called Irwell Evans. He was just outside of a small Welsh village called Clonilla, which is just outside Aberystwyth. So that's kind of Wales, kind of this jutting out bit of the UK. Looks a bit like a pig's head with an ear, and it's right bang in the middle on the coast, absolutely bang in the middle of that area. Just off Cardigan Bay, is just outside Aberystwyth. So this thing came down during the night. Nobody heard it. Nobody heard an explosion or, an impact of any kind. And Irwell just got up the following day to check on his sheep. And, fields in Wales are pretty big. I have to say this. They're it's a valley and it's lots of patchwork of big fields. And he comes out and he looks across these fields and 4 of them have got this debris. And he also notices the top of the trees missing and a lot of other bits and bobs sort of knocking around. And he thinks, oh, I must have had a plane crash. This is bad enough for it to be something quite serious. So he phones the local police, and the police are like, well, you're the only person reporting this. They contact the local Air Force base. And about 2 or 3 hours later, all these military vehicles pull up. And it's a cleanup operation. That's clearly what it is. So they wheel out lights and they floodlight it, and and they spend the rest of the day, the rest of the night, cleaning these fields of all the debris. Now, the thing that Irwell said that was interesting is he said it was like a scene out of a James Bond movie. He said, and there's people dressed in suits ordering uniformed police officers and uniformed RAF personnel around. So at that point, you've got 3. You must obviously got 3 agencies, because you've got police, you've got the Air Force, but you've got somebody else as well being involved in the cleanup operation. So when Gary got this newspaper article, it was about 2 weeks after this crash had occurred, and he contacts Irwell because Irwell's in his area. He knows Irwell, so he phones him and he says, "Can I come down?" And Irwell's like, "Well, not sure you're going to find anything, but you can come and have a look." So Gary goes down with a team, small team of his own, goes all over the fields, doesn't find a thing. They've done a fantastic job. They've cleaned the fields completely. But then Gary thinks, there's no way, because it was going dark, it was nighttime, there's no way they're going to get all the bits out of the woods. That's just not going to happen. So they pile into the woods, and sure enough, in amongst all these broken trees and trees that have been flattened and branches sheared off, they can see a couple of bits of metal stuck in the trees. So they prize those out. They pick a few more bits up from the floor and a couple of bits of something that looks a bit like tin foil. So they end up with 6 pieces, 6, one decent sized fragment, a couple of bits of the foil, and then a few smaller bits. So Gary says, "Oh, can we come back in a week's time with metal detectors?" And Irwell's like, "Yeah, okay, you can." So they come back again and they don't find anything this time. So he says, "Okay, we'll come back again and we'll give it another try." Anyway, between the second visit and the third visit, he gets a phone call off Irwell saying, "You're not going to believe this, but the Forestry Commission have come in and they're actually taking the woods away. They're demolishing the forest. They're tearing it up and taking it away." So Gary phones the Forestry Commission and he says, "About this forest at Clonilla, what's going on?" And the guy on the other end of the phone says, "It's wind damage." And Gary's like, "Well, do you normally take forests and woods away for wind damage?" And the guy's like, "No, but in this case, we are." And Gary's quite funny, actually, because when I did a documentary with him about the crash, he was laughing. He was laughing at this point, and he said you could tell the guy on the other end of the phone was laughing as well. He'd obviously been instructed, to remove these trees. So a few days later, after this last phone call, because he doesn't go back, you see, he gets a knock on the door. So at this point, you're out of January, you're into February, you're probably heading towards March. In 1983, which is when the crash occurred, January, so around about the first 3 or 4 days of January, this crash occurred. He gets a knock on the front door, Gary does. So he's going to the door and he can see the shape of 2 guys dressed in black in suits. So he opens the door. Sure enough, you know what's coming. They're dressed in suits, black ties, incomprehensible passes, dark glasses, hats. And Gary glances down the road, where he lives, and he can see two black SUVs with all the windows blacked out and no number plates. And these guys just look at Gary and they just say, can we have our metal back, please? Can we have these fragments back? And Gary's like, no, you can't. And they're like, oh, why is that then? And Gary's like, well, I've broken one of the pieces up. I've put them into key rings and I've given the key rings to all the people I know who have got connections to media, press, television, etc., etc. I've got one of these key rings. He said, so you've had it, the cat's out the bag. And he said, as long as you don't come after me metal again, you don't come knocking on my doorstep again, I will not tell these people to release their fragments to the media. He said, but if you come back, I'll go public. So these guys are like, okay, fair dues. They just walk off in silence, get in the cars and drive out the close, never to be seen again. But it is interesting. I mean, it's not in the book, but it is an observation to say that, they must have known what this thing was, because that's how they turned up to do the cleanup operation. The men in black were there to do that. They knew that Gary had obviously been poking around in the woods and got something. They knew where Gary lived and they turned up and asked for the metal back. So clearly somebody was really on this. They were really on the case, watching what was going on, I mean, Gary's a public speaker. He's a public figure anyway. He's been on the circuit for quite a long time. He's an older guy. He's even older than me, but he's oldish. You won't mind me saying that. So you could find out where he was. It didn't take like secret services to locate him. You could find out, who was in charge of the UFO community up there in North Wales. And that's the story. That's the basic structure of what happened that sort of fed into us making 25-year documentary in 2008, Europe's Roswell, which was, the original documentary made for, as you rightly said, Reality Films, released as a DVD, available on Amazon, and it's now gone up again. We've remastered it and we've put it back up with a company called Drake, Michigan. So you can go and watch that on YouTube. It only came out last month. We put it back out to coincide with the book. But that's the basic story thus far, up to releasing the book. There's a little bit, there's a bit more.
Can I ask, so if I would like to clarify what you think happened. I think you said that the craft did not actually crash. It didn't hit the ground. It sheared off some trees or did some damage. Do you think so? You don't know if it came to ground somewhere else or?
Well, as far as we know, I mean, it's a good question because we did a freedom of information thing with the base. They had no idea. So clearly whatever it was wasn't one of theirs. It wasn't UK RAF. They were quite justifiably able to say, no, this is nothing to do with us. So clearly something didn't come down anywhere else either, because there was no other reports of anything at that time. But yeah, it's interesting because how it managed to fly off, nobody knows. And early on in the case, we conjectured that whatever it was, this craft, it was about 25 feet wide, because you could see where it cut through the trees. We conjectured that this craft must have been designed for either high pressure, high speed, or maybe even interdimensional travel. Because what happened was, when it slowed down, which it's not supposed to do, and then got pummeled at slow speed by the trees, it shattered like eggshell because it wasn't doing what it was designed to do. It punctured the craft and smashed all this material off. And then the craft itself, the solid element of it, then was still able to carry on. So clearly it's not designed for slow travel and low impact. That was something that became obvious fairly early on. We think that's how this stuff got broken off and got scattered.
Very interesting. All good questions. Is it possible? I know you talk in the book about witnesses who have seen craft rising from the ocean. Is it possible it might have come from that direction?
Well, it's initially when I first sort of brought this out, as it were, as a documentary in 2008, I was doing a talk at a conference and this lady came up to me and she said, I was a student at Aberystwyth Art College, she said, at the time that this crash occurred. And she said, I'm sure it was that morning I opened the curtains in my student digs and I could see this thing coming up, this light coming up in Cardigan Bay from under the sea. She said, so I very quickly grabbed my camera. And as this thing broke the surface of the water, she said, I managed to get a photo of it. And I'm like, yes, that's fantastic. Brilliant. I said, scan it or send me the negative or, somehow, I gave her all my details. And sure enough, I never heard anything back.
Oh.
So the answer's probably that is true. It's probably part of something much bigger. Now, fast forward to now, in preparation for doing the book, when we were talking to Gary, Gary said, "Oh yeah," he said, "stuff like that's happening all the time." He said the local Coast Guard has got a hotline phone number to the RAF base, and every time they see these lights come up, they just phone the base. So I'm like, oh, okay, it's common knowledge. So clearly, it does happen all the time, especially in North Wales. There seems to be a sort of triangle of the North Wales bit. And these things seem to whiz up and down the valleys and, appear out of the ocean. And, I even witnessed one up here when I was in the 1980s, 81. I witnessed one go through steam on a power station, that's 40 degrees. It's coming out of the top of a cooling tower, so clearly it was able to go through that. I put that at the start of the book. That's one of the opening stories at the beginning of the book, because it sets the scene. So things are happening. More things were happening and still do happen in that area of North Wales.
Yeah, perhaps it even re-entered the water, and that's why the craft has never been found going into the ground. Who knows? When I was doing my book a few years ago, I did a chapter on USOs, unidentified submerged objects, and I was looking at kind of in history also, and some really far back. And there is, and you probably know this, a story about a base, or maybe it wasn't a base, but it was kind of like an Atlantis type civilization that was on the coast of Wales. And that's possible that is underwater now, has been for hundreds or thousands of years. And so that was one thing I found really interesting, there's been stuff going on there for a long time.
Well, archaeologically, it is actually true, because when we have super low tides, very often you get forests coming up. You get the roots and the ground surface of submerged forests. So it is known that the Irish Sea, which Cardigan Bay is a part of, it's known that the Irish Sea has at some point, risen and flooded other areas. I don't necessarily subscribe to it being, the Isle of Avalon, which is what some people think it is.
That's right.
The Sunken Isles, the Western Isles. Yes, it's in the West if you happen to live in Wales, but, I think there's kind of two stories there that have been, pushed together. But yes, there's possible that there's something down there. Very, very possible.
Yeah, Dan?
Well, I was going to say I was struck by, this is where the Roswell connection comes in. Both Gwen and I have been involved with MUFON, and we've been field investigators for MUFON. And of course, Roswell's part of, seems like it's inextricable. I can't even say it. Anyway, it's tied.
Tied.
It's tied into UFOs. But the part of the story where the farmer comes out and finds a debris field sounds a whole lot like Mac Brazel and Roswell having the same kind of experience.
Well, if you look at the Roswell playbook and you look at, we don't have marsh gas or weather balloons or any of that nonsense. So there's none of that in our story. But in the story here, you've got basically the same structure. As you say, you've got one farmer, you've got one debris field, which was cleaned up as fast as humanly possible. It's rumoured that Matt Brazel kept a case of debris that he hid before he died, possibly in his last house. And lo and behold, we have the same thing here. We've got a case with debris in. Only we know where ours is. That's the only difference. And then you've got, strange things going on in the cleanup team. You've then got Roswell. You had one day, the Roswell Daily Record put out the newspaper article. Right. That was on the day and the day after. You've got exactly the same thing over here. It's Sunday Express, and it was one article Nobody else covered it. It was just that one article, which is really odd. So again, you've only got the one article. So already the parallels are, stacking up. In the book, actually, I don't write about the parallels in the book, but Gary did. Gary actually wrote quite extensively. He looked at all the parallels. He managed to fill about 2 or 3 pages of A4, with direct parallels. And last but not least, and again, this is not even in the book because his notes are, I put the notes in the appendix, but the last but not least bit is that about 3 or 4 weeks before the book went to print, somebody with a metal detecting machine found a piece of foil, this honeycomb foil, on the Roswell site. And it's the same foil as we've got on our site over here. You can look at it visually and it's the same thing. It's identical. So you can clearly see here there's some similarities in craft, nature, timing, the playbook, the cover-up, the whole way that it ran. It literally is. It is. There's nothing else that's happened in the UK that runs quite as close to Roswell as this, as the story we've got.
Yeah, that is amazing. The parallels are, if it was a man-made craft, then that might make more sense because maybe, the UK, the US, other countries are making these craft and they're all using the same stuff and they're flying around and crashing. So, but I don't know. I mean, that might be one reason to point in that direction, but if there's nothing else, then
well, there is something else. This is the next stage, because we did the 2008 documentary at 25 years, and then it's Philip Mantle at Flying Disc Press. He's the guy that's published Europe's Roswell, 40 years now, 40 years since Impact. So he was like, yeah, we've got to do something. We've got to put this book out. We've got to, bring it forward again as a story. And then he got sort of a twinkle in his eye and he said, well, I wonder if we could get hold of some of the debris and get it analysed, because that's the obvious, it's the obvious next step. Now, back in the 1980s, Gary had friends at British Aerospace in this country, which is the military manufacturer over here, and he managed to get a piece into British Aerospace for an informal analysis. It would have cost him thousands back then to get it properly analysed, and the informal analysis came back and they basically said, oh, it's duralumin, it's an alloy of aluminium, and that's all they could tell him. They couldn't tell him any more than that, really. And we don't know what the green substance is or the paint or the resin. We have no idea what any of that is, but the metal's duralumin. So Philip approached Gary. Gary's been really protective all these years of the pieces he's got. So he kind of, sent a message over to Gary. Well, do you think, we could do some analysis? Much to everybody's surprise, a few days later, this jiffy bag comes flying through the post, with 3 pieces of the metal in. So Philip's like, yeah, we could do this. Let's do it. So we did. There was a laboratory in Australia that we approached, and there's a laboratory in America that we approached. So we sent 1 piece to Australia and 1 to America. Now, all along, for the whole of this 40-year period, everybody has assumed that the metal is the same. Okay, so bear that in mind. So we send one piece off to each of these labs. Anyway, the Australian lab comes back and they go, right, it's not duralumin. It's definitely not duralumin. At which point we're like, I wonder if British Aerospace were trying to put us off the scent, try and cover it up, because duralumin is a standard metallic substance, and the name duralumin is a bit like Coca-Cola or McDonald's. It's a brand name for about 200 different types of aluminium. Now, what British Aerospace did say was, this is a really pure alloy and it's not something we're aware of. We'd like to know where you got this from. This is back in the 80s, when it went to them. Anyway, Australia come back and they go, it's aluminium foam. At which point, aluminium foam. Now, the way it works is apparently you can mix aluminium with a certain other substances and it foams and then it goes hard at room temperature. So you end up with this substance that's extremely light, extremely strong, and quite easy to produce. So we're like, okay, aluminium foam. Anyway, in addition to that, they also say, which we already knew, that the painted coating, the green coating, is not aerodynamic, and the resin on the other side, they said it looks like an American type of glue. So going down the route that you said, at this point, we're thinking, well, maybe it's one of ours. Maybe that's what it is. At the same time as this set of results come in, we get the results back from the American lab. So those results come in, and you open the first page of the report, straight away on the first page, it says substance unknown. So we're like, what do you mean unknown? So the analysis, when you look at the analysis, it's like 0.0% of this and 0.2% of this. And right down at the bottom, it's something like 94% lanthanum. Lanthanum. What is that? So we go off and we start looking at this lanthanum. Now, also bear in mind that they couldn't identify the rubbery coating on it. They didn't identify the resin as an American type of glue, and they are an American laboratory, so they should know. And this lanthanum is an exotic metal. Now, by exotic, it's quite common, okay? It's all over the place. It's like, basalt and quartz, and it's everywhere. It's number 27 in the most common substances on planet Earth, but it's also in the upper atmosphere. It's in the universe. It's in galaxies. It's in meteorites. It's in asteroids. It's in comets. It's everywhere. But, and this is the kicker, if you like, it's really difficult to extract. It costs a fortune to get this stuff out. Now, back in the 1980s, 90s, you'd have been talking hundreds of thousands of pounds to get the smallest amount of this stuff extracted. Now you're talking about millions of pounds, millions of dollars to get this metal out. And then me, Philip, and Gary, all of us are like, they didn't have either of those substances, aluminium foam or lanthanum. They didn't have them in 1983 when this thing crashed. Officially, those substances didn't exist. If it was in a vehicle that was flying, and you'll appreciate this yourself, it takes 3 or 4 years to develop something that you can throw up in the air and actually fly. So you're talking about stuff here that would have had to have been developed in the late 1970s, 78, 79, 80, 81, you're talking that period. So then that kicks it in the other direction, and that makes it look alien, because it is an alien substance. It's not something we would, use at all. Is it one of ours? Is it one of theirs? It's like, and then you've also got it's over 60 years, 70 years now since Roswell. And then you've also got, since the technology the Germans were developing in the Second World War, 90 plus years, you call it 100 years they've had to develop that. So it could also be back engineered. It could be something that started out as alien and then has been developed by us. So there's the middle position, if you like. So it could be theirs, it could be back engineered, or it could be one of ours. Now, in the book, you'll have noticed I don't come up with any real hard conclusions, because what I'm kind of hoping that somebody will take one look at this and go, oh, I know what that is. But that very rarely does that ever happen in archaeology or ufology. That's very rare that happens. So I've just put the facts in there. They are the raw facts. But I mean, I've said this on a few interviews, this whole business of disclosure and stuff that they're debating now. This is knocking on the door, it's scratching at the door of disclosure, because we're actually saying, well, hang on a minute, we've got it. We've got pieces of this thing now, it physically exists. So for goodness sake, somebody out there, tell us what it is, disclose, so it's very much in that vein. It's, as we used to say over here, it's poking the tiger. You're trying to get a response, and that's what I'd like the book to do. I'd like the book to get a response, of some kind, other than Men in Black. They can stay out of the frame for me.
I just saw something on the news today that the Roswell UFO Museum has now cracked its 1 millionth visitor. And so if you haven't done it yet, I think you need to send your books to them and and work with them. And I'm sure that they would be thrilled and to do that. So.
Well, there's a nice crossover that most people forget, because in the 1990s, National Geographic sent archaeologists out to the crash site, and they sieved most of the desert looking for stuff, and they got little beads of this
Right.
exotic metal from the crash site. Most people have completely forgotten that. So it's not like I'm not, I'm not the first archaeologist to get involved in something like this, but it is about time, like you say, the crossovers, the similarities, the potential for disclosure. I'll have a word with Philip and see if I can get him to send some books over there.
Oh, yeah, I think
Yeah,
that would be terrific, and this would really be
yeah,
timely,
yeah,
time to do it. Yeah.
yeah,
Dan.
I was thinking about a connection, another kind of a connection, in terms of your background, Mark, as an
yeah.
archaeologist. And I think I got this from the DVD I watched about this incident, that the speculation as far as where this craft came from. Well, obviously, you look up in the sky at night, there's a gazillion stars, which have planets associated with them.
Mm.
So it could have been from outer space, but you taught or implicated that another possible origin of the craft was the future, from our future. And
Well,
what I
not
started thinking about,
not
yeah,
actually the future, believe it or not.
okay, go
Uh,
ahead.
do you want me to?
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that's
I mean,
intriguing to me.
you're correct. You're correct in the sense that a lot of ufology now is looking at the idea of interdimensional possibilities.
Hmm.
Since, and I won't go into it in detail, but since the whole moon landing thing has kind of the bubbles burst, it doesn't seem likely that that kind of, in and out of the Van Allen belt and all this kind of travel, that is looking less and less likely. So people are looking elsewhere. And
Hmm.
the UFO community has gone off in the direction of, well, maybe these guys are time travelers, so they're coming back from the future.
Hmm.
Now, I've gone the opposite way because being an archaeologist, being involved in the past in the way that I am, I've studied the idea of things like paradox. So, for example, they could come back from the future to here and destroy themselves because they haven't happened yet.
Hmm.
So that particular paradox is a real danger. You can't be messing with your own past, but you can come from the past and travel to your future. You can do that because you've ruled out the possibility of paradox. Now, I did another book called Crystal Skulls and Human Heads, where I examined the idea of genetic super races, people with these enormous skulls. And it struck me very strongly when I finished that book that the similarities between how those people would have behaved and how those people look in the past, there's too many of them to the similarities with the aliens we see now. These greys, these people, that suddenly appear because they've got, one head, two eyes, hands, arms. I call it Star Trek syndrome. Budget aliens can't afford anything other than things that look like us dressed up. So my simple conclusion was, well, maybe it is us. Shoot, it's a duck. Why not? Because there's just a possibility that these guys with these enormous heads, these things are wet computers. Their capabilities and what they could do is so far ahead of us that maybe, just maybe, back in the days of Atlantis, like you mentioned earlier on, maybe they cracked the problems of time and space. If Tesla can do it and Einstein can do it, and we can do it in theory, maybe these guys with these enormous heads, with these huge computer brains, maybe they actually did it in practice. It also has a nifty sort of way of solving a few problems as well. It's always been a standing joke, aliens travel 100 million miles and then abduct a cow. It's why would you do that? Well, if you're coming from the past and you want to find out where the planets ended up, then you're going to abduct things. You're going to abduct people. You're going to abduct cows. You're going to take so many samples. Now, they might, for all we know, they could have, abducted a badger or a squirrel or goodness knows what, but you're just not going to notice. Farmers are less likely to spot that. But if you turn up and pinch a cow and then drop it back when you finish with it, or a sheep or whatever, they do turn up, and we do notice that. And people, well,
people.
yeah, I think they're actually time travelers. I think they're interdimensional. I think, I got no problem with that at all. They have the technology to do that. Certainly the physical evidence and the analysis and everything we've got so far, it's pointing to some kind of supercraft, super technology. And if they came from the past to see how the planet was now, then that's exactly what you do. You take biological specimens and biological samples, etc. And it would also explain why every now and again something goes wrong. You know, you're not telling me that these fantastic aliens could travel all the way across the galaxies only to end up planting into a cow field in Wales. It's never going to happen. It's clearly we would do that. You know, if it's technology that's time traveling from the past, then there's going to be mistakes. You know, this thing could have just come out of, warp drive or whatever you want to call it, come out of full speed, traveled through dimensions and materialized halfway through a forest.
Halfway through.
You know, it's plausible. It's actually within the bounds of possibilities. A lot of things in ufology frustrate me because they do go beyond the bounds of common sense almost. But no, this is very much common sense, very much. Excuse me.
You mentioned time. So I'm going to ask you about something that I had not heard of before, but I saw it in your book, and that is the cone of time.
Yes.
Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, if you look at the whole of human history, excuse me, which is something that a lot of people involved in ufology, especially the sort of ancient aliens route, if you like, they tend to look to the past and then try to see how that fits in with everything. So I don't think anyone would deny that it looks like we've had so many civilizations and so much stuff that's more advanced than us. We tend to rediscover. We don't find anything new. You know, it's nothing new under the sun, as they say. But there seems to be more of everything in the past. I'll give you an example. Hold on. Dinosaurs. That's your best example. There's so many more species. I think at the last count there was it something like 24,000 different species. There's only about 18,000 left now, and it's increasing all the time. Anyway, what you've got a situation. Just a minute, let me have a drink. I was doing so well. It's because it's freezing cold over here.
Yeah,
you've got a situation where things are quite obviously decreasing. And in that situation, you've obviously got a big picture that's getting smaller. And that really, in a nutshell, that's how the cone of time works. But everything is getting smaller. So there are less species, there are less of us, the environment's decreasing, there's less of that. Excuse me, the fossil record is really showing you just exactly what is no longer here, what has vanished. So the cone is, as it were, winding down. Now, I don't know if you have them over there, but the thing that struck me is over here it was like a child's toy. You used to get them in arcades, and it's like a spiral. It is a spiral. You drop a coin in, and the coin whizzes round this thing, and as it heads into the middle, it ends up literally spinning so fast that it's stationary, and then it drops into the next thing. And I thought that is a brilliant illustration of what's happening to everything. Everything is spiraling down, and it's getting faster. Excuse me. So you get things like the Babylonians, where they're early kings. I think the first 8 kings end up ruling for something like 284,000 years, and there's only 8 of them. And because the lifespans, the time periods they're talking about are colossal, and yet you look at what's happening now, if you make it to 60 or 70, you're like, yeah, that's pretty good. 80, 90 is extraordinary. 100's miraculous. So clearly that is also going down that same spiral. So all I did really in putting the cone of time in was to verbalize that idea and to visualize that idea of how things are decreasing, which again would explain why somebody from the very, very distant past would want to come and see what was going on now, because the coin is literally, it's spinning, and we're on the verge of whatever is coming next, which in my opinion might actually be another cone. Maybe the cones feed into each other and it's a constant recreation process, which again you see in the past. The planet's gone and it's come back, and then it's gone and then it's come back. So that's really what the cone of time was all about. I'm doing a major conference in February, and I'm going to do a PowerPoint on it. So hopefully people will be able to follow it, because it's essentially a new idea based on old information. I think most people have sort of seen it, but not actually said it. Best program, Ancient Aliens. I mean, I appeared on there as an interviewee in season 19. The lads on there are all they're miles ahead of me in terms of looking at the evidence, but it's joining the dots. When you join the dots. Poor old Darwin, though, in evolution, it just you can almost hear the toilet flush as he disappears. It's gone. That just doesn't stack up. The evidence doesn't. Yes, there's obviously, I mean, origin of species. There's adaptation. There might even be mutation, but that's not sufficient to sustain us, obviously in the way that this decay has occurred over tens of thousands of years. We're not seeing anything turning into anything else. DNA has pretty much sunk that as an option. Unless we interfere. We could interfere and change DNA and what have you, which the aliens guys are saying the same thing. Maybe these guys have come back at some point in the past and interfered, so that it's changed our future, not theirs, but ours. And again, that's possible. It's a possibility. But the guys with the enormous heads, going back, I'm bouncing all over the place here, subject-wise. The guys with the enormous heads, the last of them only died out about 400 or 500 years ago. They've been with us up to, what archaeologists would say is relatively modern times. So yeah, we're losing more than we're gaining, I think. But that's
one of the things I wanted to ask about is, and I don't know that you may not identify yourself as a ufologist more so than an archaeologist, but what's the state of the conversation about UFOs in the UK? You're probably familiar with David Grush in the United States.
Yeah.
Our Congress seems to be kind of ambivalent. Oh, we've had this secret government. This is Stephen Greer talking. Had this secret government now that's been covering up all this kind of stuff. We have all kinds of crash retrieval kinds of things. And then when you get down to the specifics of actually putting legislation or programs in place to get at some of this stuff, then no one's home. So I'm wondering what's going on in the UK. How the government there?
There's two things I can throw into that. The first thing is I have gone public and said that I don't think the men in black, and I don't think the people that you see in public positions, I don't think they are the guys in charge. I've got a saying which I'm perpetuating now. It's the men in grey. And I think the men in grey you'll never see them. You don't know who the names are. They're nothing to do with the media. They're not pushed forward as leading lights. They're in every single country. They talk to each other, and basically they're running the show. And the reason I can confidently say they exist is if you've got a jigsaw puzzle and you pull a piece out, you can usually see what the missing piece is by looking at the pieces around it. You can clearly see that it's missing, and they are the missing piece. So I go totally along with this idea that there is somewhere out there. It's not a government, because it's not politics. It's not elected, but there are people out there who control it all, and it's not Bezos or any of the big names that you know about, or Musk or forget it. They're not the guys that are running the show, because if they were, you wouldn't know about it. Okay, so that's the criteria. You're looking for a gap. It's what's not there that's important. And the second thing is, well, how are things going over here? We've got this problem, and the problem is that we're British. So the British have got certain things that we talk about, certain things we don't talk about. So I'm an archaeologist who has witnessed at least 2 UFO incidents. And I've also been on site as an archaeologist and had my team of archaeologists come running in the middle of the night going, oh, this big silver disc just buzzed us, flew over us. And so I've been in the world where, people have been able to share with me. I've got, there's loads of anecdotal stuff in the book. I've thrown in pretty much everything I've got really there, except maybe that one about the archaeologist being buzzed. But, and people feel quite happy to share. But generally speaking, in the UK, we don't. The guy who lives in the house next door here could have been abducted and he would never tell me. It's not what we do. We're British, we don't share things like that. So the level of debate over here is quite subdued. Our government, doesn't, have a department for that as far as anybody knows, with the UFO conferences, especially the awakening ones, which I'm involved in now over here, they are really pushing it forward. Some of your guys from over in the States have come over and, last couple of years, and it's go with the sort of the transatlantic communications lines are opening. So I could see things really, opening up for us in the future. But no, at the moment, it's seldom debated. That's the best way I can put it.
I used to teach sociology for a living. And so one of the things you just said kind of intrigues me. The cultural differences between the British and the Americans. Why would that culture not encourage sharing of anomalous events where it seems like everybody, Gwen and I belong to something called OPUS, Organization for Paranormal Understanding and Support. People are coming out of the woodwork over here talking about their experiences. So what is there culturally about Britain that makes that a little bit more challenging?
I think it's the idea that, especially if you're a professional, for me to come out and say what I've said is exceptional. It's quite radical. Don't know if I'll ever end up in a trench digging with a trowel ever again. It's one of those kind of things, because they just think it's crazy. They think it's, lunatic nutcase kind of territory. That's the man on the street kind of thing, until it happens to them.
Right.
When it happens to them, then it's a different story. But I'll give you an example. I can tell you quite an interesting story. I did an interview for the book. We have a newspaper over here. It's a bit like you've got the National Enquirer. Okay, ice cream van found in ice on the North Pole. It's this kind of level of press coverage. Michael Jackson's working in a chip shop in New York. It's that kind of. Well, that's kind of where we're at. Well, we've got one over here as well. One over here is called The Sun. Now, The Sun is not, it's not top journalistic stuff by any means. But I did this wonderful interview with this lady reporter for The Sun. And she took the book absolutely deadly serious, which came as a shock to me and to Philip. So that was the first thing. So clearly things are changing. Clearly it's a topic now where the press, it's low down on the press level, but they're still, taking it seriously. And then she did this wonderful little video thing that went up on the Sun's website, all about the fact that there is just the possibility that this might be real, that there is something about it. And I was quite shocked, because it's a different approach from the UK media. They are swinging in the right direction. First UFO I saw was back in the 1970s. So, I've been sort of on that page for a long time, but only very recently have people in the UK started to catch up. It's that fear of being called a nutcase. I think that's what stops the Brits.
Well, I think there's somewhat of that same fear here in the United States. Gwen, do you have anything else for Mark here? We don't want to keep him up too
long.
long.
Fire away.
Yes. I want to talk, since Dan mentioned, I have a long experience or a history of working with experiencers directly as a therapist. And then Mark and I work together in this organization, Opus, where we counsel and help support experiencers. Yeah. And we do have some international people who reach out to us for support. And we have quite a few from the UK, from various locations in the UK. So I'll ask you, are are experiencer, that is contactee, abductee support groups? Are they fairly common there across the UK, or would it be something that's really rare, or how do you see that?
Right, okay. I'm going to come at it from a funny angle. It's more or less a matter of PR, because I think if it's happened to you and you're a part of that community, so you're aware of something like the Awakening, etc., the conferences, I think once you get in there and you realise that these things are available, then you'll make use of them.
You will make,
But
okay.
from a PR point of view, I think the man in the street, the general public, hasn't got a clue, doesn't know that these things are there. It's like I said, the guy in the house next door, for all I know, he could have been abducted. You know, he could have, he might be an abductee, but he would never tell me.
Never tell you.
He would never talk to anybody about it. And the last thing he'd do is go looking for a site where he would talk to other people about it. So that's the ordinary man in the street. But then once he cottoned on, once he found out that he wasn't alone and realized that these things are there, then maybe that's a possibility. You know, maybe that's a route that he would go down. So I think it is literally just basic PR. You know, we're behind you in terms of social and cultural acceptance, you know, and development. We are lagging behind. But then if you're aware of what's going on internationally, like yourselves and me and others, we're not lagging behind. We're probably slightly ahead of the game. But you know, that's it. It's just PR. It's just knowledge, knowing, you know, what's available. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yes, it does. It does. Right. So I guess, Dan, I would do a closing question, but if you want to go ahead and do a closing question, that would be fine.
Ladies first.
Okay. All right. So one way that we like to end our interviews on Anomalies is to ask our guest, with all of your experience, all the years that you've lived, experienced life, your intelligence, your perception of people and what's going on around in the world, how do you think that humanity is doing at this point? And do you think that we have a promising future, or do you think things look pretty grim?
Oh, what an awful question. And the question is, how honest am I in answering that question? I mean, you're asking an archaeologist who specializes in digging up things that have been wiped out.
Yeah.
What a terrible question. Yeah. Right. Well, put it this way. I'm going to dodge it slightly, and what I'm going to say is, right, none of us get out of here alive. None of us. So inevitably, we're all going to die. So there is going to be an end. There has to be an end for everything and for everybody. The real question is, what do we leave behind, and how can we improve what we leave behind? So I'm on both of those ballparks. One is, yes, I'm pessimistic, and you know, all things end, and etc., which again is the ultimate outcome of the cone of time, which we discussed earlier. But it's not about the dead, it's about the living. You know, that's the other side of the same coin. How optimistic I am about that, I don't know, because I'm seeing triumph and tragedy. Since we've been through pandemic and all the rest of it, you know, some people shone as real stars, and they've come out sort of fighting, and other people have just disappeared and gone under and really failed in what they were setting out to do. So in that sense, we've had a real shake-up, and it does worry me. I've got to say, it does worry me what kind of world we're going to leave behind when we inevitably step out to another dimension. There you go.
So that means we don't know.
Well, all I've done really is told you what we know. That's what we do know. I'm 100% convinced we go on to somewhere else. And I'm 100% convinced we need to pay attention to that, you know, as individuals. But where it is and how that works out is a story for another day, maybe.
Mark, it's been a real pleasure meeting you and having you on the show. We appreciate you taking the time. You have a really great sense of humor, and it looks like Stampy may have gone to bed. But
yeah, he's vacated.
He's vacated the premises. But thank you very
Yeah.
much for coming on with us.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. If you can, if you ever need me again for any topics, give me a shout. I'll be glad
Well,
to do it again.
and if you want to come back or you want to suggest other guests, we're always open to that. Gwen, you
Mhm.
want to give people a preview of what's coming up on Anomalies?
Sure. First of all, we want to ask you to like us and, come back and see us again. And let's see, I'm looking at my calendar here. So I think our next program is going to be our very own Daniel Hall, who's going to give us a fascinating presentation on a tragedy that occurred in the United States, the Silver Bridge collapse, which happened. When did that happen, Dan?
That was 1967.
67. And one of the things that makes it was a terrible tragedy, like 47 people lost their lives. But one of the things that makes it really intriguing is it may have been predicted by Mothman, if you know who the Mothman image feature is. So Dan's going to talk to us about that. And Dan, we have also someone else who's going to be with us. Who is that? I'm looking, and it looks like we're going to be in January then. So I'm not sure that what we
Yeah.
have then. So anything else you want to contribute?
No, I think that's enough of a contribution. Happy holidays to Mark, and
Thank you.
we'll see you down the road, hopefully.
Yeah,
Yeah.
same to you
Thank
guys.
you very
Thank you.
much. See
Thank
you
you.
later.
Okay, let me end the meeting here, if I can do that.